Our speaker today is Phil Armstrong. Phil is President and CEO of the Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice. He's a native of Ohio, has a master's degree from Central State in Ohio, and undergraduate from Central State and a master's from the University of Akron. Phil's been involved in the community here in Tulsa for over 20 years, has been on the Community Service Council, Reading Partners of Tulsa, chairman of the board for the Greenwood Cultural Center, and project director for the 1921 Race Massacre Centennial Commission. And we really appreciate him coming today to speak to us. So, Phil, I will turn it over to you. Come on up.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
There you go. Good morning, everyone. I will do my best. I know that we have a lot going on and been advised that the graduation ceremony will make this as short as possible, but it's hopefully as informational as possible. Hopefully, some of you have remembered me and coming here to sing several times, being invited by Kelly Ford. I consider him, the old saying, a brother from another mother type of thing. And so we've done a lot of musical projects around the city of Tulsa and traveled before. So it's just great to be back with you again this morning. Part of my presentation will be reflective of the history that once again we're coming upon the 102nd anniversary, and not so much looking on the negativity part, but always and never forgetting. As the saying goes, those who forget their past are destined to repeat it. So we'll always, just as we acknowledge and recognize and never forget the atrocities of the Jewish Holocaust and all that came out of that and what we learned from that, the rise of hatred, we as a city, as a state, as a nation should never forget the atrocities that led to the violence of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Never forget it, but don't just resonate on it. Where do we go from here? What did we learn from that? And to expound on relationship, reconciliation, love for all mankind to go forward. And that's what we are called to do as Christians anyway. So you've heard a little bit about the background from me, and I want to touch on that history. I want to touch on a little bit of Juneteenth. So I've been in Tulsa now 25 plus years. As the old saying goes, the Lord willing and the creek don't rise. I'll be here 26 years in October. And for those who are born and raised Oklahomans, I promise you, it still is, unfortunately, it still is a thought for those who are not from Oklahoma. No one still wakes up and says, you know what, I've always wanted to move to Oklahoma. It's still not a part of people's vocabulary. And in 1997, I promise you, I didn't say, I'm moving to Oklahoma. It was a job transfer, and it was my best friend, who to this day, lifelong best friend that I met on the campus of Central State University in Wilberforce, Ohio. It is the equivalent of our Langston University, an HBCU. There are two HBCUs in Ohio. They're right across the street from each other. One is Wilberforce University, funded by the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And then right across the street, Central State University, which founded in 1887. Langston was founded in 1886, 1889, that same period. Wilberforce University was founded in 1855, 8 years before the emancipation of slaves. True story. Wilberforce University was created for the children, I'm sure you all have heard the term mulatto, the mulatto children of slave owners, who needed their children to be educated. And they were of mixed descent, obviously, but they could not go to universities in Ohio. And so Wilberforce University got its start out of finding a place that these mixed children of slave owners could get their education. That was the start of the historically black college, Wilberforce University. That's the time period that, we reflect upon. And there's a lot of incredible history here in Oklahoma about that era, right after 1865, we call the Reconstruction era. I'll get into a little bit of it here. OCCJ, so I've been 3 months in as the president and CEO of OCCJ. As you know, it started out as the National Conference for Christians and Jews. That organization actually started in 1924. Does anybody know what precipitated the founding of NCCJ? It was the rise and hate from the Ku Klux Klan that was taking over the country. Remember, it's 1924. We're 3 years after 1921 here in Tulsa. And no other state had as much of an increase in the membership of the Ku Klux Klan than the state of Oklahoma. From 1919 to 1929, a 10-year span, no other state had this robust increase in its membership than Oklahoma. But it was spreading, that mindset was spreading across the country. So in 1924, the beginnings of a national conference for Christians and Jews began out of, and it was white men, religious, affiliated white men, Catholics and Jews and Christians and Baptists, and that said there's got to be a different voice that's coming out of this country than this rise of the Ku Klux Klan. That's where the beginnings of National Conference for Christians and Jews began. It really reached its apex in 1928 when a presidential candidate named Al Smith ran for president. He was the governor of New York, and he was a Catholic. And the Ku Klux Klan rallied against him. You don't want a Catholic running the United States of America. We kind of had that a few years ago when a certain candidate ran, didn't we? You don't want a Lutheran running. You don't, not a Lutheran, but Latter-day Jesus, Mormon. You don't want a Mormon running. It's funny how time repeats itself. But that was the rise of this hatred and using politics to tear somebody down because of their religious beliefs. And then in CCJ, we've got to start something. And it really, really started really at that moment. Creating chapters all over the country. Oklahoma started its chapter in the 1960s. Nancy Day, who has become an incredibly friend and mentor for me, ran NCCJ here for almost 30 years. The national model, because chapters all over the country were raising money for this mission to fight against bigotry and bias and racism. But the money that was being raised in places like Oklahoma was all going to New York to fund the national office. That model started to fall apart. And in 2002, NCCJ declared bankruptcy. And it started to falter throughout the states. And they said, basically, if you want this work to continue in your states, you will need to create your own charter, your own entities, and you're going to have to, number one, raise money to fulfill the mission because you're going to be on your own. And OCCJ was born, Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice, to broaden the aspect. So it's not just Oklahoma Center for Christians and Jews, Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice. And Nancy Day, with corporate partners and philanthropic partners and private citizens all over the city, all over the state for that matter, raised $600,000. And it was deposited and sent to Tulsa Community Foundation, who is the holder of that. That was in 2004 to 2007, and that has been what has sustained OCCJ in its work all the way up until now. She retired a few years ago. Moises Echeverria was the CEO, became the president and CEO shortly after that. He is one of those success stories. The program of NCCJ, and still the prominent program of OCCJ, is Anytown, Camp Anytown. And they used to actually go to a camp. They would select a different campsite, and for 1 week, their focus was getting 9th graders, 10th graders, 11th graders, 12th graders from different communities, black, white, young, freshman, senior, and really with intentionality wanted to grab students that would not otherwise interact with each other. Let's get some students from Booker T. Washington High School, and get some students from Cassia Hall, and let's get some students who go to the Catholic Church, and students that go to the Baptist Church, and students that go to the Methodist Church. Let's put them in a week-long get to know each other, go through these exercises of understanding. I don't have to believe what you believe, and I'm sure not going to make you believe what I believe, but we've got to learn how to live in community with each other and learn how to respect each other's chosen way that they have decided to live their life and believe the way they live, and then us learn how to respect that and learn to create relationships in spite of those differences. Anytown has been going on in Oklahoma. Next year will be the 30th anniversary of Anytown. There are people that are running some of our major companies and corporations in the state of Oklahoma that can still remember when they went through Anytown when they were 16, 17, 18. And they'll tell you, it changed my life. Growing up in Oklahoma, it changed my perspective of how to live in community with people. So OCCJ has been going on strong with that program. Of course, we still have our interfaith program, our dialogue series. We now have an Inclusive Leadership Institute where companies can send their employees and to spend 3 days now over Zoom learning these concepts that are from a political standpoint seem to be very controversial. If you watch Fox News or MSNBC, it will keep you divided. But ILI, Inclusion Leadership Institute, says, you know what, let's teach what these things are so people can understand from a very professional and educated construct, what is this thing called pronouns and why are people using them? Why, not indoctrinating anybody, but where does it come from and why? And things that are controversial. What is it for a person to say they identify as LGBTQ? Not, again, indoctrinating anybody, but just how do you understand why somebody chooses to live that way? What are these different religious beliefs? What are still the biases that people still have from, and this is how I explain it. People who say, oh no, I'm not biased. I love all people. But that same person, black or white, and you grew up in a household, or you grew up with Papa and Mama sitting at the kitchen table saying things about another group of people, and they just rattle things off, and you grew up in that, and you heard that, and it shapes a little bit the way that you grow up. It shapes your perspective on things. And when you get older, when you get under pressure, or you get something puts you in a situation where you're angry and you see that person and that represents what you heard when you were a kid growing up, and it comes out, ooh, where'd that come from? Where do these biases come from? And so we have this very, very engaging. In fact, some of the Quick Trips and the Williams and the One Oaks and the BOKs of the world, they send their employees, we have this, and they go back just like, wow, I'm glad I took that course. It's opened my mind to a few things, So OCCJ's work is still very powerful. And if we didn't understand how powerful and how much is needed, we just need to go back about 3 weeks and see the ugliness that came out of McCurtain County and Ida Bell. And it's not a shock, for someone who's an African-American male. I've dealt with, ignorance, and that's what it is. It's just ignorance in many different forms, in many different ways. I think the shock for people was not so much, for black citizens, it wasn't so much that there's these guys sitting in what they thought was a private meeting saying, I wish we could go back to the days when you can lynch black folks and things like that. The shock is these people got elected. The shock is that people went into a voting booth and voted. I want that guy to be my sheriff. I want that guy to be my county commissioner. Now, either they were the best charlatans and never, ever exhibited that behavior anywhere, or there's a percentage of people that kind of know they kind of felt that way. And everyone has to take some accountability in that they were in those positions and they were elected. The other thing to explore is, wow, and if your mindset is that way, and you're a county commissioner determining where funds go and where projects get funded in the county, I wonder how often you made sure that projects and money went to areas of the community that looked like you, and money was denied or maybe pulled back from communities that you don't like. That's the danger in that. And it's 2023, and yes, we still have that mindset to deal with. So OCCJ's mission is needed now more than ever before. The mission: to inspire and equip Oklahomans to overcome bias, bigotry, and oppression. So I woke up on a Thursday morning. That report came out on a Tuesday, and I woke up about 3 and 4 in the morning on a Thursday, and it just couldn't let me go. And I'm 2 months in OCCJ, and I'm thinking, how in the world can we be in Oklahoma in 2023? And I've just spent the last 5 or 6 years of my life bringing black folks and white folks together under the 1921 Centennial Commission and built this beautiful Greenwood Rising Black Wall Street History Center, and people are learning this, and that's still going on just 3.5 hours away. We've got to do something. And I gathered my staff together, and I said, you know what? We've got to get some students to come to any town from Ida Bell. If we've got to go out there and get them. And I made a few phone calls, sent an email to the mayor of Ida Bell, a black man, and got a hold of the reporter that actually made the recording. And I said, man, I would just love, I said, I've got a few people that I've shared this with, and I said, they are willing to pay for, if we can get 10 students. I said, what will get Ida Bell on a new track is you start with the young people. You impact them and their mindset for the future of where you want Ida Bell to be. Not that everybody in Ida Bell thinks that way, but you got to start somewhere. And I said, if you can just round me 10 people. And he said, you've got to talk to this teacher. Her name is Sharon Hill Wooten, and I'm going to give you her number. So I called her, and I left this message, who I am. I'm sitting in Tulsa. I'm the president of CCJ, Anytown. I'm trying to do this in, of course, like a 30-second message. You know, I know this has come out of the blue, but can you give me a call back? And this is how God works. She calls, and I answer the phone. I said, oh, this is Miss Wooten. Oh, Miss Wooten, I'm so glad you called me back. She said, wait a minute. She said, I can't believe I got this message on my phone from you. And I said, why? She said, in 2002, my daughter went to Anytown. And she said, to this day, she talks about the experience and how it changed her life. She said, in fact, I was the van driver that drove the kids to the camp that year. And so I was like, wow, isn't this amazing? And I said, well, I told her what we want to do. And I said, and me and my staff, we're going to get in my car and we're going to drive down there so that parents can see who they're giving their kids to, because you give your child up for a whole week and we make them put up their cell phone. Now they get to, once a day they get to call in, but for the whole time they are separated from their cell phone. And I said, we'll drive from Tulsa. They can know. And she said, oh, that would be great. So we got in the car, drove down to Ida Bell, 3.5-hour drive one way, and spent 1 hour with about 10 students and their parents. And we put them through a couple of games that we do with the students so they can, this is what we do in Anytown. And they were so just thank you. And I said, OCCJ wants to stand with this community because we got to start with healing. We got to heal this. We got to get this, eradicate this out of here. And so I called, now we have it, instead of going to a different camp, we now have it at Oklahoma State University. In 2017-18, they just started having the whole week on a university campus to encourage these kids, and gives them that excitement on being on a college campus, and hopefully they get inspired to go to college. And of course, and by the way, I have a son at Oklahoma State University now, and he's going through their veterinary sciences program. He just finished his junior year with 3 A's and 1 B, and so he's doing very well. But Oklahoma State also see the potential, like these kids might want to come here one day. But I called and said, the problem is getting parents in these rural areas to bring kids a 3.5, for them a 4-hour drive. They said, don't worry about it. They're sending a bus, an Oklahoma State University bus, to Ida Bell to pick those students up and bring them to camp. They just have to show up. Everything's paid for. That is the community that I want people to understand thrives here in Oklahoma. There are more of us that want to see people learning to live together, even though we have differences, than there are the three knuckleheads in Ida Bell that's got all the attention from national news, because everybody thinks that that's how everybody thinks in Oklahoma now. And we have to have a different message in saying we have something like OCCJ that gets kids together and changes their mindset so they don't grow up thinking that way. So I didn't mean for it to be such a big commercial for OCCJ, but it's as you can see, I'm passionate and vibrant about the work, even just since being here. But let me give you just a little bit. I'm gonna tie this in actually to I told everyone, I said I actually have a Sunday school lesson. And I'm going to drop this out here, and I'm going to close with where I'm taking this. But there is a passage of Scripture from the Old Testament book, 2 Samuel, the 9th chapter. By the way, if you're like, what's he doing? He's going down and dabbling in areas. My father is 29 years. Last year, he retired 29 years as pastor of the Baptist church that I grew up in, Mount Carmel Baptist Church, Bidwell, Ohio. So I'm a PK, preacher's kid. I was when I moved here in 1997, I accepted a calling, as they say, and was licensed in the ministry. But the church where I'm at now, Metropolitan Baptist Church, under Dr. Ray A. Owens, I was ordained in 2014. So I got a little bit of credential here. I'm not stepping in water I'm not unfamiliar with. But the Old Testament book of 2 Samuel, the 9th chapter, talks about this story of this young child with this long name, Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth. And David is king, and he is looking for anyone from the house of Saul. And if you know the story about Saul, he didn't have too good of a relationship with Saul. Saul tried to kill him. Saul tried to keep him down, and David ended up conquering. And, of course, Saul was killed, and then his best friend, who was Saul's son, Jonathan. David and Jonathan had a relationship. Jonathan was killed. But David goes out to try to repair, remember that word, repair damages of what had been done in the past. Is there anyone from the house of Saul that I can bless, that I can be kind to, that I can repair some past damages? And they go and find there is this young boy that was the son of Jonathan, Mephibosheth, but his legs he's disabled, he can't walk. Go and get him and bring him to my table. From this time forward, he'll eat at my table, and I'm going to restore all the land and everything that belonged to him through his grandfather Saul. I don't have to do it. It says because of kindness, I want to do this, restoring it. Remember that verse. I'm going to get back to it. So let me give you some history here, and I'm going to run through this very, very, very quickly. For those, just by a show of hands, how many of you have actually visited the Greenwood Rising Black Wall Street History Center? Excellent, excellent. So I'm going to run through this and make this quick so that we don't go into too much detail, but I want to tie in a couple of things. So anybody remember Bass Reeves? A lot of people come to Oklahoma to find out about Bass Reeves, the most successful deputy marshal that pretty much ever lived. He is still highly regarded among U.S. deputy marshals to this day. And many people have no idea that this was a black man. He was able to eloquently speak, of course, obviously English, but he could interweave his way into the tribes, the 5 civilized tribes are in Oklahoma. He spoke fluent Cherokee and Creek. He was known for being very crafty. He brought over 3,000 felons to justice. He only had to murder, or I shouldn't say murder, but only had to shoot 16 villains or 16 in the course of bringing 3,000 people to justice. But here's his thing. He would disguise himself. He would infiltrate gangs and act like he was somebody, and then when he got close to his villain that he needed, you're under arrest, I got you, you know. He was known for being crafty. The real life of Bass Reeves is actually the story that was created for the Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger is a story based on the real life of Bass Reeves. And I grew up watching Lone Ranger and never knew. And that's why they have the black mask. It's a throwback to that we're talking about a black man. Now, so why, and so, Phil, where are you getting this? Reeves is the subject of the season 2, episode 4, The Gunslingers, The Real Lone Ranger. I believe outside of St. Louis, they actually have a Bass Reeves museum. They talk about, the Lone Ranger Museum. But, he died and is buried in Muskogee in 1914. He's buried in Muskogee. But imagine when The Lone Ranger came out, it was a radio program. And you're hearing about this crafty Western guy who's arresting these villains. Now, that was on the radio. Now, could you imagine the pushback when the Lone Ranger would go to television and white folks all over the country see a black man arresting white folks? That's why the Lone Ranger that we know of is a white man in a black mask. Because it would never, ever have gotten on TV if they'd have shown a black man arresting white folks. That is a true story. And everything, what's the old say? I dare you to fact check me. I dare you. Because you'll find out a whole lot of information that our history books didn't tell you. We talk about the Dreamland Theater. We know that it was the most prominent theater in the state of Oklahoma. Of course, it was destroyed in 1921. John and Lula Williams, they owned that theater. They owned candy stores. They owned apartments. Some of the wealthiest black people who lived in the United States was living in that little place that we call Greenwood. In fact, the wealthiest black community that we know of in the United States to this point, do you know a place called Boley, Oklahoma? Boley, Oklahoma, in 1885, 1886, they had a black-owned bank, the first ever of its kind. They owned vast amounts of land because of their land allotments through the tribes. That land had oil on it. Most of them were farmers. But they were highly industrious, incredibly industrious, and they were extremely wealthy. That's 20 years before we even get to the creation of Greenwood. Greenwood didn't get a start till 1906. We didn't get statehood till 1907. So here's Boley, Oklahoma in the 1880s with a black-owned bank. How many of y'all remember reading that in your history book? So it's not, when people say, why are we going back into history and talking about this stuff? Because we didn't learn it. And imagine the inspiration this could have given little black boys and little black girls if they'd have been taught this, that, hey, not everybody who was successful in the 1880s and 1890s were just white people. There were very successful people that looked just like you, that owned businesses and owned banks. And do you know how encouraging that may have been for some children of color to have learned that in school? It would have been very powerful. It would have been extremely powerful. Moving forward, I love reading this. Hannibal Johnson, incredible author. He's written 13 books, most of them on the history of Greenwood. He is the world's foremost authority. He was the lead curator for the history in Greenwood. This book is 21 years old that he wrote. It's the Bible of, if you want to know everything about what was Greenwood and how did these people get this money and wealth and land and amass all this fortune. Get Black Wall Street by Hannibal Johnson. But there is a letter of correspondence. We talk about the spirit of Greenwood and what that spirit was. And it's right here in this letter between Oliver and Curtis. He says, Oliver, I am by our local newspaper fully advised of the whole terrible tragedy there. Now that they have destroyed your homes, wrecked your schools, churches, and business places, and killed your people, I am sure that the Negroes will rapidly give up the town and move north. Enclosed, please find draft for $40 to purchase your ticket to Detroit. We'll be expecting you, Curtis. This was Kurt in the days right after the massacre. Here's where the spirit of Greenwood comes in. This is his response to that letter. Dear Curtis, how kind of you to volunteer your sympathetic assistance. It is just like you to be helpful to others in time of stress like this. True it is, we are facing a terrible situation. It is equally true that they have destroyed our homes, they have wrecked our schools, they have reduced our churches to ashes, and they have murdered our people, Curtis. But they have not touched our spirit. And while I speak only for myself, let it be said that I came here and built my fortune with that spirit. I shall reconstruct it here with that spirit, and I expect to live on and die here with it. Oliver, 1921. That's amazing. That really is amazing. Here's the historic black towns. This comes from the Oklahoma Historical Society. There were over 50 all historic black towns in thriving Oklahoma from 1880 all the way up into the 1940s. Of course, there are only about 9 of them that are incorporated and left to this day. But that was no other state had this proliferation of historic founding of black towns and black communities that thrived well. This is a land allotment ceremony between the government and individuals of the Tishomingo tribe getting their allotments, just representations. E.P. McCabe, he actually was the gentleman, he partnered. Booker T. Washington's mindset was this: Reconstruction era, after 1865. If black people can be self-sufficient, educated, professional, reliant, his thought was white citizens would see these freed slaves as equals because they could be educated, they would be producers in society, and they could live alongside with them. He thought that the more black citizens that got educated and professional, that it would eventually eliminate racism. That was his. And his business partner that tried to put that forth in Oklahoma was this gentleman here, E.P. McCabe. He's the father of the black town movement. He literally would go into black towns and tell these communities, be organized, create businesses. He was just one of those that said, we've got to, the vernacular that would have been used back then by people of this mindset would have been, let's show the white man that we can live our lives and be producers and be efficient and be productive. We want to live equal with the white man. That was his focus. He actually purchased the land, you can see there, that became Langston University. So he's a progenitor of that. This is Greenwood. People want, when you go downtown and you see the Greenwood Rising Museum sits on this corner, Greenwood and Archer, and then you just see the historic Greenwood buildings in this small block. And people come and they really can't, picture in their mind, how big the place was based on this little corner. But this was Greenwood. 10 to 12,000 African Americans living north of the railroad tracks, the racial dividing line. They call it the Negro Tulsa was north of the railroad tracks, and then downtown Tulsa. But all of this, 33 to 35 city blocks at that time, from all the way up to Pine Street, was what was referred to as the black community of Greenwood. Since we're pressed for time, I want to get through, and I want to move forward and get to the rebuild. We also know the story between Dick Rowland and Sarah Page. He's accused of attacking her. The Ku Klux Klan gets word of it. They go in to try to nab Dick Rowland because he's been arrested, and then the fight breaks down downtown, and you have 18 to 20 hours of destruction from May 31st to June the 2nd. This is what's left. But the real story is the resilience, the fact that these people said, we shall not be moved. This is our land, this is our home, we will rebuild our community. And that they were able to do it in such a significant way. The fame of Greenwood really was all over the country in terms of black communities. And here you have the heavyweight boxing champion, Joe Louis, flew into Tulsa in his private plane in 1937 to help dedicate the black hospital with the Greenwood Negro Chamber, Moton Memorial Hospital, and he's standing there on the steps. That was in 1937. They rebuilt Greenwood and made it even twice the size. By the 1940s, 1943, Greenwood was double the size economically. Over 1,200 registered black-owned homes, over 200 registered black-owned businesses. It was thriving even more after the destruction than before this destruction. And that's really the story of that Greenwood was destroyed by hate, but the spirit of the community brought it back. And you can see Greenwood there in the 1940s. Urban renewal and eminent domain is what kind of was the second death to Greenwood in the 1960s. And then a spiral, economic downward spiral that just went from there. And so to see Greenwood coming back, to see the city of Tulsa setting aside $10 million to help the infrastructure to redevelop all the land that's north of the I-244, where Oklahoma State University sits in Langston. All that vacant land is all owned by the Tulsa Development Authority. And so there's two major projects that over the next 5 to 10 years will develop there. The Kirkpatrick Heights development and the Evans Fin Tube development. Those are long-term projects. But it's just the fact that we're here at this point trying to say, you know what, you and I weren't there. It happened 100 years ago. We're not here to try to blame white folks for what happened 100 years ago. And we're not trying to rebuild this segregated society of blacks and whites. We're trying to say there's got to be something that we can do. We are stewards of what's been passed down to us. And you and I, black, white, young, old, we all share in this. What is the future of racial relations? What is the future of Greenwood and communities like this? And can we do this together? How do we restore some of what was destroyed in terms of economic, education, and the community, and do it together? And that's the difficult part. That's the hard part, because there's still those forces that don't want us to get along. But I think there's more of us than there are of them. And I think Greenwood, the city of Tulsa, race relations, Oklahoma, I definitely believe that the future is much brighter than our past. And so how does this tie in to 2 Samuel 9? Just as David said, I am in a position to help restore what was lost to the house of Saul. I want to help restore what was destroyed. I put forth to you that 2 Samuel 9 is the first biblical reference to what we refer to as reparations. And reparations is not writing a check and just giving it to somebody, even though that's what the general consensus is. Reparations means to repair past damages and make amends. King David was the first to say, I'm going to repair some of the damage that took place when Saul was trying to kill me, and I'm going to restore it back to his grandson. That's reparations. So as we, focus in on this history, and as we get ready to go, and I'll take a few questions if there are, and we come upon the 102nd anniversary in the next 2 weeks, and even beyond that, Juneteenth, we're now, have a federal holiday. What's the big deal? A federal holiday for Juneteenth. 1865, June the 19th, 1865, the last holdout of slaves were told in Galveston, Texas, you all are free. You've been free for 2 years. They just didn't want to tell you down here. You were actually freed in 1863. But the last holdout of slaves are finally told. And so we finally say, hey, this is when everybody was freed. June 19th, 1865, Juneteenth. And it is a part of American history. 1776, July 4th, is when we broke away from the tyranny of Great Britain and we became a free country. But guess what? In 1776, not everybody was free in the United States. And so that's why there's acknowledgement of freedom in two different forms, but freedom in the United States. And this is how I put it to many of my friends. I'll come over to your house and grill hot dogs and celebrate American patriotism on July 4th. If you come over to my house on June 19th and celebrate American freedom and have some barbecue and pork chops and stuff like that. We're still celebrating freedom, but it's acknowledging that there were some different things going on and not everybody was free at the same time. It's not taking the place. It's not trying to rewrite history. It's saying, yeah, we celebrate July 4th, but we also ought to celebrate June 19th too as a country. So that is my talk this morning. And you can go tell your pastor, man, he talked about reparations in the Bible. I don't know. See what their response is. But I thank you for this time. I know you got a graduation to go to, but thank you for letting me be here today. I think there's five minutes left. You got to go at 10:30. Is there any questions? Yeah.
I taught a Booker T for 29 years.
Oh, my goodness.
But
Wow.
I wanted to ask you, one thing that's disturbed me so much is this push in Oklahoma for against diversity.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's directly counter to what you're trying to do.
Yeah.
And as you
Yeah.
push back yourself,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. So for those that couldn't hear it back, he was wanting to know about the push against in Oklahoma, not just Oklahoma, but around the country in very, I'll say in very political terms, in extremely political terms, the push back against anything that even spells of diversity, equity, inclusion. And unfortunately, it's really all politicized. That's the main thing. It's just become a politics tool to separate people and think that this is a horrible thing. We actually had an Oklahoma congressman a month ago in the western part of the state stand up in front of a group of people and said that the teaching of diversity, equity, inclusion is demonic. You know, it's statements like that they're just birthed out of ignorance. It makes the work very difficult. The pushback, I know Governor DeSantis is going to run for president, and last week he put some new acronyms. He said DEI should stand for division, indoctrination, and exclusion. And everybody, oh yeah, those are some good words, and they're just jumping all over it, but they have no idea. Let me give you one quick fallout from if they remove funding for DE&I programs. Here's just one negative impact from that. Oklahoma State University, under their diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, they get millions of dollars from the state of Oklahoma to make sure that rural students in Oklahoma get to go to college. Guess who the majority of those students look like? They don't look like me. The vast majority of students who receive funding, grants, and scholarships through DEI to attend Oklahoma State University come from places like Idabel and Poto and Miami and the Panhandle. So if they eliminate funding, they're going to eliminate the ability for white students, poor white students in rural communities, to go to Oklahoma State University. That's the political fallout, is that they get on these bandwagons and have no idea the impact that they're having. Diversity, equity, inclusion is simply what we're doing here. Let's sit at a table and talk about the differences that we have and acknowledge them, but in spite of that, what do we have in common? And how can I share a little bit of my experience and your experience with me to help me understand you and you understand me more? Does it go off the rails at times? Yes, it does. Do we have teachers that say things they shouldn't say? Yes, we do. Do we have people that take things way too far and sit in the classroom and, you know, but they're the minority? You know, no child, black or white, should be made to feel guilty because of their race or identity. And those teachers who do that should be immediately removed from those classrooms. But those are minute instances. The vast majority of teaching of equity and diversity and inclusion is really what we're doing here. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Thank you so much, you all. Yes, ma'am. The Tulsa Metropolitan Ministries. Yes. So we had a new strategic plan to focus some of our programs we hadn't been doing much, and so, you know, where we're applying dollars to get impact. So those dollars go to our education for youth and programs. But I'm actually next week, in the next couple months, I'm going to be engaging with the interfaith community, Tulsa Metropolitan Ministries, so that we can continue what we had before. And that was a dialogue series where we'd go to different churches and have these have luncheons, have dinners, and have conversations and bring different speakers. Yes, that is still a strong focus of mine and OCCJ.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, kids, I think it's time for a commencement Sunday, so let's see if we can get some kids graduated. All right.